Now chances are on your picture you're finished and you have all of the terminology on there. But one of the things that I wanted to point out was specifically how this diagram is set up to show levels of organization. And when I told you to color the picture, I said that should be the title of the picture, Levels of Organization in a Muscle. And that's because every time we have one of these sort of structures here, we're actually getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And a few of you asked me about this and then realized what the diagram was showing. Each of these sections is expanded from its actual size. So for example, this section up here isn't actually this big. It's like I took this little bit of tissue and blew it up and made it bigger so that I could see it. And then for the next level, which is here, I took one of these little circles and blew it up so that it looks kind of like a ham, somebody said, and I realized they were right. It does kind of look like a ham. And then for this section, I took one of these circles and blew it up and expanded it. So even though they all look about the same size on the picture, these things are not the same size. And so I wanted to highlight a few of the words that are on your diagram. This word is probably not on there yet because it's the smallest unit of a muscle, but the other words are. Now right here, this is your bone, and the thing that is attached to your bone is a tendon. I didn't include those two things in levels of organization of a muscle because so far I haven't touched a muscle. But a tendon is how muscles are attached to bones. So the first thing that we have sort of after our tendon is the beginning of the muscle. So it's really, really vague where the tendon ends and the muscle begins. All I want you to recognize is that your muscle is not directly attached to your bones. It's attached to a tendon. The tendon is attached to your bones. Does anyone know what a ligament is? They're things that you can tear in your knees very commonly. Has anyone ever hurt one of their ligaments, like their MCL or their ACL? So ligaments are little pieces of tissue that go from bone to bone, whereas tendons are between bone and muscle. It's a very small distinction, but essentially they're both bits of tissue that help your bones stay together and move correctly. So if I take a muscle, the whole entire muscle, this is quite large. Now some of your muscles are huge, like your quadriceps muscle is actually a bunch of different groups of muscles put together. Some of your muscles are very small, like the muscles in your eye that make you blink or the muscles that make your pupil change size. These are tiny muscles, but muscle is always the sort of the highest level. Then we have muscle fiber bundles. So when I take a look at everything that's going on here, muscle fiber bundles, the way the name suggests, is a bunch of groups of muscle fibers put together. And inside of that is a muscle fiber, and that is what we call a muscle cell. And I really want to highlight that word. A muscle fiber is a muscle cell. We could use those two words interchangeably. So if on your picture you called it a muscle fiber, add the word cell. What's unusual here is that muscle fibers or muscle cells have a whole bunch of little subcomponents. Normally, when we get down to the level of cell, that's pretty tiny, but muscle cells are actually pretty big, sort of in the grand scheme of things. Each muscle cell, so this section here is your muscle fiber, your muscle cell, and you can recognize your muscle cell because it has the sarco words in it, like the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the sarcolemma, which is the membrane of the muscle cell. So when you see the words sarco, sarcoplasmic reticulum, sarcolemma, those tell you we're in the muscle fiber, which is the muscle cell. Now, inside the muscle fiber, there are subcomponents, myofibrils, so they're little chunks, little round pieces. And each of those is made up of even smaller parts, the myofilaments. Now, they look different on the picture in your textbook on purpose because there are two different types. If you colored them the same color here, that's okay. We just wanted to get the general category, but there are actually two types. So some of you noticed that they were two different colors in the textbook, and that was on purpose because there's actually two different kinds. The last word I added at the end so that later when we talk about how your muscles contract, you know where we are in the muscle. But when we get to talking about muscles contracting, this little piece down here, which is even smaller than a myofilament, myofilaments have sections on them called sarcomeres, that's what's making your muscle contract. And we'll talk about muscles contracting probably in our class on Wednesday or Thursday. So, you should be aware of how big or how small something is. This would make a really excellent numeric response question. Like put things in order from biggest to smallest or smallest to biggest. I would almost always put a muscle cell in the list somewhere because it's something that people think is really small but is actually one of the bigger components on this list. So if I'm looking here, this is big and these are small. So I went from the biggest to the smallest down the list. And that's how the picture is organized too. We're sort of going from biggest on the left to smallest on the right. Now the last thing that I wanted to make sure that everybody had was a bit of vocabulary. Some of this will already be on your picture. So for example, these things are probably all already labeled on your diagram. But you might not know what it is that they do. These are all components of a muscle cell. And remember, if I said muscle fiber, I would be talking about the same thing. So just like any cell, it has parts in it, but it has some different or distinctive parts compared to just your average regular animal cell. It has myoglobin. It has a sarcolemma, which you labeled on your picture. It has sarcoplasm, and if you recall, I told you that sarco was the prefix for muscle cell, basically. So hopefully you can see that these three things are kind of like regular organelles, but specifically for a muscle cell. And then for the myofibrils, which you labeled on your picture, there are two types, thick and thin. What I'm interested in is a little bit of a description of what it is or what its function is. If you were to look in your textbook on page 336, that is where you would find it.